The wind sweeping across the Midwestern plains carries a century of silence, a quiet that settles heavily over the small rural communities dotting the landscape. In the heart of this vast agricultural expanse lies a town forever anchored to a single, unimaginable night. Before the summer of 1912, Villisca, Iowa, was a thriving hub of commerce and rail travel, a place where doors remained unlocked and neighbors knew every face on the street. That profound sense of security was shattered in the early morning hours of June 10th, when a phantom slipped into a quiet home and committed an act so brutal it continues to defy comprehension. The illusion of safety in early 20th century America was a fragile construct built on the promise of community and the isolation of the frontier. This prosperous settlement, with its bustling town square and grand Victorian homes, represented the very ideal of the Midwestern dream. The residents prided themselves on their churches, their schools, and their thriving local businesses, completely unaware that their beloved community was about to become the epicenter of a horrific national spectacle. The darkness that descended upon them would not only claim 8 innocent lives, but would permanently alter the psychological landscape of the entire region. The evening of June 9th had been filled with the innocent joy of a Children's Day service at the local Presbyterian church. Josiah Moore, a prominent local businessman, and his wife Sarah had spent the evening celebrating with their 4 young children. Accompanying them were 2 visiting friends, the Stillinger girls, who had asked to stay the night in the seemingly safe confines of the Moore household. As the congregation dispersed into the humid night air, the family walked the short distance to their modest white frame house on quietly shadowed streets, entirely oblivious to the watcher waiting in the dark. Inside the home, the evening routines concluded with the quiet domesticity typical of a Sunday night. The 6 children, ranging in age from 5 to 12, were tucked into their beds, their minds likely filled with the lingering excitement of the day's festivities. Josiah and Sarah retired to their own downstairs bedroom, the house settling into a peaceful slumber. They were a family deeply woven into the fabric of the community, respected and beloved, making the impending violence all the more incomprehensible. The vulnerability of sleep would become the ultimate betrayal in a home that offered no sanctuary. Morning broke with an unnatural stillness surrounding the property, a silence that slowly drew the attention of concerned neighbors. Mary Peckham, an elderly woman living next door, noticed the absence of the usual morning clamor. The chores remained undone, and the house was entirely locked up from the inside. As the hours ticked by and her knocks went unanswered, a creeping sense of dread prompted her to call Josiah's brother, Ross Moore. The mundane act of checking on a quiet house was about to unlock a scene of unparalleled terror. The discovery within those walls remains one of the most chilling tableaux in the annals of American crime. The killer had moved systematically from room to room, wielding an axe to end the lives of all 8 occupants as they slept. Yet it was the meticulous, almost ritualistic arrangement of the aftermath that elevated the crime from mere slaughter to something deeply sinister. The perpetrator had carefully covered the faces of the victims with bedclothes and clothing, draped every mirror and window in the house with fabric, and left a plate of uneaten food on the kitchen table before vanishing into the dawn. News of the massacre tore through the streets like a physical shockwave, transforming the bustling hub into a landscape of overwhelming grief and immediate paranoia. The realization that an entire household could be eradicated without a single scream being heard shattered the foundational trust of the residents. Hardware stores sold out of locks, firearms, and ammunition within hours, as families barricaded themselves inside their homes as night fell. The community was suddenly fractured, every unfamiliar face on the street, and even lifelong friends, viewed through a lens of profound suspicion and terror. The early 1900s were an era defined by the expansion of the railroad, creating a transient undercurrent beneath the surface of settled society. Drifters, traveling salesmen, and anonymous laborers moved fluidly across the country, riding the rails from one town to the next with minimal scrutiny. This constant flow of nameless strangers provided the perfect camouflage for a mobile predator, a ghost who could strike in the dead of night and be hundreds of miles away before the bodies were even discovered. The very infrastructure that brought prosperity to the region also delivered its ultimate nightmare. Amidst the chaos of the ensuing manhunt, the investigation's gaze eventually fell upon Reverend George Kelly, a traveling minister with a deeply troubled history. He had been present in the town on the night of the tragedy, attending the same Children's Day service as the victims before departing on an early morning train. His subsequent behavior drew intense scrutiny. He sent rambling letters to investigators, demonstrated an unnatural obsession with the details of the crime scene, and even posed as an undercover detective to question locals. A man of the cloth suddenly became the focal point of a desperate search for answers. The case against the eccentric preacher was built on a foundation of bizarre confessions and circumstantial oddities. He eventually signed a detailed confession to the murders, claiming that a voice from God had commanded him to slay and slay utterly, though he later vehemently retracted the statement, citing intense police coercion. Investigators pointed to a bloody shirt allegedly sent to a local laundry by the suspect, and psychological profiles suggested his left-handedness matched the swing of the fatal blows. Yet, the physical evidence tying him directly to the blood-soaked rooms remained frustratingly elusive. Two separate grand juries convened to weigh the fate of the enigmatic minister, tearing the town apart in a bitter ideological divide. While some residents were utterly convinced that the strange, rambling man was the architect of their nightmare, others believed he was merely a fragile mind caught in the crosshairs of a desperate police force. The trials were a media spectacle, drawing reporters from across the nation to document the sensational proceedings. Ultimately, the juries failed to secure a conviction, leaving the suspect to walk free and the community utterly devoid of closure. As the focus on the traveling preacher waned, the investigative lens shifted toward a much closer, deeply personal theory championed by Detective James Newton Wilkerson. He directed his relentless crusade against State Senator Frank Jones, a powerful local figure and a former employer of Josiah Moore. Their relationship had soured dramatically after Josiah left the senator's hardware business to open a competing store, taking a highly lucrative John Deere franchise with him. The narrative pivoted from a random act of madness to a calculated, cold-blooded assassination born of intense financial rivalry. The animosity between the two businessmen was an open secret on the streets of the small town, fueling endless whispers of corporate sabotage and deep-seated grudges. Wilkerson alleged that the senator, humiliated and financially wounded by his former protege, had hired a brutal hitman to eliminate his rival. According to this theory, the murders of the wife, the children, and the visiting guests were merely collateral damage, a horrific necessity to ensure no witnesses remained. It was a narrative that transformed a respected local leader into a ruthless mastermind orchestrating slaughter from the shadows. The allegations against the prominent politician ignited a firestorm of controversy, leading to rampant speculation of widespread corruption and a deliberate suppression of truth. Wilkerson publicly accused local law enforcement and political allies of actively destroying evidence and intimidating witnesses to protect one of their own. The community was forced to grapple with the terrifying possibility that the architect of the massacre was not a wandering phantom, but a neighbor who still walked among them. The resulting slander lawsuits and bitter public feuds only deepened the wounds of a town desperate for justice. Beyond the bitter local disputes, a broader, far more terrifying pattern began to emerge from the archives of early 20th century crime. Between 1911 and 1912, a string of strikingly similar axe murders plagued the Midwestern rail lines, leaving a trail of butchered families in towns from Colorado to Illinois. Federal investigators and regional detectives began to connect the dots, suggesting that the massacre was not an isolated incident, but the work of a highly prolific transient serial killer. The realization that a singular monster might be riding the rails cast a long, dark shadow over the entire American heartland. The signatures left at these disparate crime scenes were chillingly consistent, pointing to a perpetrator driven by deeply ingrained ritualistic compulsions. In almost every instance, the killer struck in the dead of night, using a weapon found on the victim's own property, and meticulously covered the faces of the deceased and the reflective surfaces of the home. Furthermore, the strange detail of leaving a plate of food or a basin of bloody water near the bodies was a recurring hallmark. These specific, grotesque calling cards strongly suggested a single, deranged mind operating far beyond the confines of a local business dispute. The clash between these competing theories created an impenetrable fog of confusion that ultimately doomed the pursuit of the truth. The fragmented nature of early forensic science, lacking fingerprinting standardization or DNA analysis, meant that physical evidence was often contaminated by the throngs of onlookers who had initially trampled through the crime scene. The authorities were left to navigate a labyrinth of contradictory confessions, biased testimonies, and circumstantial clues. The true identity of the perpetrator became hopelessly entangled in a web of local politics, national panic, and fundamental investigative failures. In the decades that followed, the modest White House on the quiet residential street stood as a silent, decaying monument to the unsolved murder. It became an isolated entity within the community, a physical manifestation of the unresolved grief and the lingering terror that refused to dissipate. Families moved in and out, but the structure was forever tainted by the memory of what had transpired within its walls. The house seemed to hold its breath, preserving the echoes of that dark night while the rest of the world slowly marched forward into the modern era. The psychological toll on the generations raised in the shadow of the Villisca Axe Murders cannot be overstated. Children were brought up with strict warnings about strangers, their bedtimes haunted by the knowledge that locked doors had not been enough to save the Moore family. The collective trauma wove itself into the cultural DNA of the region, transforming a once trusting society into one characterized by a deep-seated, enduring vigilance. The Phantom Killer, though long gone, continued to exert a powerful, chilling influence over the quiet Midwestern nights. As the 20th century progressed, the first-hand witnesses aged and passed away, taking their memories and unspoken suspicions with them to the grave. The mountains of police reports, grand jury transcripts, and frantic telegraphs slowly yellowed in dusty archive boxes, the paper trail growing colder with each passing decade. The furious debates that had once dominated the town square faded into hushed conversations, the raw agony of the event gradually transitioning into the realm of local legend. Yet, the fundamental question of who swung the blade remained as sharp and agonizing as ever. Today, the site of the massacre has been preserved as a dark historical landmark, drawing an endless stream of true crime enthusiasts, historians, and truth seekers. They walk through the restored rooms, staring at the period-accurate furnishings, trying to bridge the gap between the present and the horrific reality of 1912. The house serves as a stark reminder of the limitations of justice and the enduring power of an unsolved mystery to captivate the human imagination. It is a place where the past refuses to stay buried, demanding attention from a world that has long since moved on. Beneath the layers of historical intrigue and amateur sleuthing lies the profound, unalterable tragedy of 8 human beings erased from existence without a semblance of justice. Josiah and Sarah, their children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, along with the young Lena and Ina Stillinger, were robbed of their futures in the most violent manner conceivable. They rest together in the local cemetery under the vast Iowa sky, their headstones serving as a quiet testament to lives brutally interrupted. The true cost of the mystery is measured in the silence of their unlived years. The community of Villisca remains forever defined by the events of that single, humid June night, a town balancing its present reality against the immense weight of its past. The residents carry the legacy of the tragedy with a solemn respect, acknowledging the darkness while striving to maintain the resilient spirit of the Midwestern heartland. The name of their home is inextricably linked to one of America's most infamous cold cases, a heavy burden for a place that once embodied the simple promise of rural peace. The shadows of history are long, and in this quiet corner of the world, they are inescapable. The killer who slipped into the darkness over a century ago vanished into the vast expanse of the American landscape, taking the ultimate truth with them. Was it the troubled traveling minister, driven by delusions, or a ruthless local businessman protecting his empire? Or was it a faceless phantom riding the rails, a monster who slaughtered without motive before fading away? The walls of the old house keep their secrets, leaving us to wonder who truly walked away from that blood-soaked room and how they lived with the silence of the dead.